The Middle East conflicts between US, Israel, and Iran has significantly disrupted global oil and gas supplies, particularly through the Strait of Hormuz, a critical route of international oil trade. This has caused energy prices to rise worldwide, leading to higher inflation and slower economic growth, especially in East Asian countries like Japan, North Korea, and Malaysia, which are heavily dependent on Middle East energy imports. This report analyzes price trend before and after the conflicts, compares its impact across these three economies, and identifies which industries are most vulnerable to those shocks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kong Lanzi. My matrix number is 312567. Today, I will present an analysis of the crude oil and natural gas markets during the 2026 US-Israel-Iran conflict. As we can see from the chart, the market experienced three distinct phases, which is pre-conflict, conflict flashpoint, and post-initial shock. In the pre-conflict phase, prices remained relatively stable. Brent crude fluctuated between $62 and $72, while WTI stayed between $57 and $66. Similarly, JKM natural gas prices remained steady, ranking from $9.5 to $11.5, primarily driven by normal seasonal demand. The turning point occurred on 27 February following coordinate airstrikes. Prices skyrocketed due to supply disruption fears. Brent jumped to over $111 and WTI hit $96 as buyers shift to US oil. A critical factor was the closure of the Strait of Hormuz on 4 March, halving 20% of the world oil supply. Natural gas followed suit with JKM prices peaking at $21.7. However, prices saw a temporary dip in late March after the IEA announced a massive strategic petroleum reserve release. Finally, in the post-initial shock phase starting 3rd April, we see a divergence. Crude prices climbed back up Brent to $123 and WTI to $105 due to ongoing supply concerns. Conversely, JKM natural gas prices eased slightly to $19.4 as high costs forced East Asian governments to implement fuel switching strategies. In conclusion, the 2026 conflict highlights the extreme sensitivity of global energy markets to Middle Eastern geopolitical stability. That's all my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Now, let me explain the percentage of crude oil import dependence from the Middle East for Japan, South Korea, and Malaysia. Japan has the highest dependence on Middle East oil among these three countries, which is 95%. This is due to its limited refinery capacity to process alternative crude. South Korea has lower dependence, which is 70%, as it has diversified its import through government policies and trade agreements, and increased supply from the United States and other regions. Malaysia imports 69% of its oil from the Middle East. Although Malaysia produces its own domestic oil, but due to refinery suitability, it still relies on Middle East imports. Next, it is about the percentage of liquefied natural gas (LNG) import dependence from the Middle East. This pattern is the opposite of crude oil dependence. Japan has low LNG dependence, which is only 11% due to diversification. South Korea imports 20% of its LNG from the Middle East. Compared to Japan, South Korea is more exposed to LNG due to long-term contracts with quota. Malaysia is different from Japan and South Korea. Malaysia not dependent on LNG from the Middle East because it has its own domestic gas production. Next, let me explain the economic impact of a 10% increase in oil price. For Japan, the CPI, which is a consumer price index that measures inflation, rise 0.3 percentage points, and GDP, which is gross domestic product that measures economic growth, falls 0.2 percentage points. Japan is less sensitive because its economy is service-oriented, with 70% service and only 15% manufacturing. This means Japan has lower energy intensity and is relatively less sensitive to oil price shocks. However, Japan remains vulnerable because it still imports 95% of its crude oil from the Middle East. South Korea is the most affected, with CPI rising 0.4 percentage points and GDP falling 0.3 percentage points. This is due to its highly energy-intensive industry like petrochemicals, steel, semiconductors, automobiles, and display manufacturing. These are all high-energy consumer sectors, which cause South Korea to have the greatest sensitivity. Malaysia shows the same numbers as Japan, with CPI up 0.3 percentage points and GDP down 0.2 percentage points. This reflects Malaysia's dual position, which is a net energy exporter and a net crude oil importer. Malaysia earns revenue from LNG export but imports 69% of its crude oil from the Middle East. These opposing forces result in a net effect identical to Japan, despite Malaysia having a different energy balance.
Based on our findings, we have three policy recommendations for East Asian countries. First, countries in East Asia should focus on diversifying their energy structures by increasing procurement from other regions. This policy is important to reduce reliance on oil and gas from the Middle East. Furthermore, governments should expand their oil and gas storage capacity to cushion themselves from any future energy shortage and the price shock that may rise. Additionally, these countries need to increase investment in renewable energy sources such as solar, wind, and hydropower energy to enhance their energy security in the long run.
Hi, I'm Isihan, metric number 310324. To summary, our report discussed how the conflict affected the global oil and gas prices through the supply disruption and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. As a result, the energy prices increased significantly. We also compared to Japan, South Korea, and Malaysia based on their dependence on the Middle Eastern energy imports. Japan is the most vulnerable, while Malaysia is less affected because it produces domestic oil and gas. In addition, rising in the energy prices will increasing the inflation, reduce GDP growth, and affected the industry such as transportation and manufacturing. Lastly, we also suggested the solutions such as energy diversification and greater investment in renewable energy to improve the energy security.